This is real. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ellen Yarashevsky. I'm the professor of legal ethics at the law school here at Hofstra, and we are delighted to welcome you and, of course, to welcome James Forman on this rainy afternoon. You look pretty dry. It's wonderful that you have braved the weather to come out, and it's terrific that we have such a good turnout. I am so delighted to both welcome James to our school and to tell you what a privilege it is to have him here, not only because of the book that you will hear about. There's going to be a book signing. It's fabulous. But he's a person known to me and known to many people here for years. Betsy Nevins, who you'll hear from in a few minutes, is one of his, or not in a few minutes, in about an hour or so, was one of his colleagues when he worked as a public defender in the Public Defender Service in D.C. And I have had the privilege over the years of knowing of his work, and he and I both started a youth justice clinic at our respective schools some years ago, so I've had the privilege of speaking with him. Many people here I know of him. They know of him through his family, a long-standing, very significant civil rights family, and hopefully many of you know about his dad and his mom. But I want to talk about now is the fact that what he's doing, the work that he's doing now, is so much in the public eye and really necessary. I can't think of much more that would be topical today than talking about the need for criminal justice reform. And I know that many of you in this audience are working on various aspects of criminal justice reform and need some inspiration, and James is one of those people who will provide that kind of inspiration. I was just saying to him that virtually every day when I open up Facebook or one of the other emails that I get, there's always a mention in James Forman's book, and today it was the brilliant, the incisive, I don't know, I can't remember the rest of it. Was a lot of language about intersectionality and a whole host of other things, but the significance of the book. And I can't really understate, or overstate, I should say, the significance of this work, because he really takes on some of the more difficult issues of young black and brown children and adults in the Washington, D.C. area, and it's a national mirror for those of us who have worked so hard on trying to change the criminal justice system. He's currently working at Yale Law School. He has a remarkable pedigree. He went to Brown University. He went to Yale Law School. He clerked for the Ninth Circuit. For those of you who are not law students, this is very prestigious, I will tell you. And then he clerked for Supreme Court Justice O'Connor. After that, he followed an unusual path. Many people who clerk will either become academics or they'll go work for law firms, but he became a public defender. And he was a public defender in Washington, D.C. for one of the best, if not the best, public defender office in the country, representing young people in criminal courts. And at some point, after a while, and I know this because I also was a public defender, it becomes a bit frustrating that you do case after case after case, with not making much of a significant impact beyond an individual case. And so he, as an activist, got very involved in a foundation in setting up a series of schools in Washington, D.C., the Maya Angelou schools, which helped formerly incarcerated people actually get an education. And this was long before criminal justice and reentry was on the front page of the newspapers. And so not only is he's an academic, he writes prolifically, not only this book, he's written for various newspapers, he's written a series of articles, he's sought after widely to speak around the country. We are very lucky he came here because he's doing a national tour, and it was very difficult to get him to come here. So we are totally delighted. We're going to hear about the book. We're then going to have a series of questions for you. For him to answer for you. And then we will ensure that you will, I say, be inspired by all that he has to tell us. So James, thank you for coming to Hofstra. We welcome you here.
Ellen, thank you very much for that kind and generous introduction. I really, really appreciate it. I've been a fan and admirer of your work for many years, so it's a real honor to have you introduce me in this way. And I want to thank y'all. I mean, I would have thanked y'all for coming, period, but it's like yucky outside, and I really appreciate folks coming, and because I do think that conversations like this one, you know, when I was a law student, you didn't come and see a room full of people coming to talk about the problems in our criminal system. And the fact that y'all are here, the fact that you're studying this issue, the fact that you're reading up on this issue, the fact that you're taking classes in law school, taking classes on how to stop trafficking, all of this kind of work, I feel like is so important, and I'm just so honored that y'all have come out. I want to say one thing. Okay, so there are books. So my thing is I want anybody who wants to be able to get a hold of a book to be able to get a hold of a book. So if you want to buy a book, then regardless of what the price that is listed on here, then I want you to come up afterwards to the book signing table, and we're going to get you a book for whatever amount of money that you are able to contribute to the purchase of that book. You will get a book, and I will sign the book. So I'm very serious about that. I have been raising some money to make it possible that we can offer books to people at a price that they can actually afford, and that will be a price determined by you. And I'll be thrilled to sign it. The one other thing I want to mention is my website, jamesformanjr.com. I am doing speaking, as Ellen said, around the country, and on the website I have various upcoming events that I'm doing. So if you have a chance to take a look at it, if you find something that's kind of worthwhile in this hour that we spend together, I would appreciate you sharing that with other people in the cities where I'm going and encouraging them to consider coming out. Don't tell them about the book offer, though, because I can't do that. I can't do that everywhere. I gotta pick and choose on that one. I thought what I would do is I'd start by talking about why I wrote the book. And my motivations mostly grew out of my work as a public defender. So I joined the Public Defender Service in Washington, D.C. in the mid-1990s. There are a lot of stories in this book, a lot of stories from representing clients. And one of those stories is a young man that I represented named Brandon. Brandon was a teenager charged with possession of a gun and possession of a small amount of marijuana in Superior Court in Washington, D.C. And he had pled guilty, so he was facing sentencing. And I had been appointed to represent him. And I had taken that job because I viewed the job of being a public defender as the civil rights work of my generation. My parents met in the original civil rights movement. They met in the 1960s. They met in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. My dad was the executive secretary. My mom was a member of the organization. They were an interracial couple at a time when those marriages were illegal in many states in this country. My dad is black, my mom is white. We just had, for the law students, we just had the 50th anniversary of Loving versus Virginia, the Supreme Court decision that struck down the laws that criminalized interracial marriage. Right, so their generation, that civil rights generation, and I say their generation, but I acknowledge that there are some people in this room that are part of that generation. I'm not going to call you out, but it's really their and your generation, if this applies to you. Changed America profoundly in ways that we haven't yet even still fully appreciated. They made it possible for somebody like me to have this bio that Ellen read, to be clerking on the Supreme Court, to have opportunities unimaginable to an African-American man of my father's generation. He grew up in de jure segregated Mississippi, de facto segregated south side of Chicago. And yet and still, even with that, I could also see in the 1990s that there was unfinished business for this civil rights movement, and the place that that unfinished business was manifesting itself, as I saw it, was our criminal system. I used to call it, and still a habit, I used to call it our criminal justice system, but lately people have been pressing me on where's the justice in the system, so I'm mostly going to be calling it our criminal system. Even then, we didn't have the term mass incarceration yet. That's how old I am. That's a term that was created in the year 2000. But we knew already 1 in 3 young black men was under criminal justice supervision. The Sentencing Project had reported that. That same report of the Sentencing Project reported that at the time, black women were the largest single growing part of our prison system. We already had passed Russia and South Africa to earn the dishonor of being the world's largest jailer, 5% of the world's population, 25% of the world's prisoners. And I could see it in my own life. I could see how this was happening. I grew up in Atlanta, mostly in Atlanta. I grew up in a mostly kind of working class, borderline, kind of middle class, mostly African American, but integrated neighborhood. And 2 blocks from my house were 2 huge buildings, massive structures. The Atlanta Federal Penitentiary and a General Motors plant. That was when I was a kid. When I was graduating law school, one of those buildings had closed its doors, and the other had built an addition. I don't even need to tell y'all which is which. So that brought me to Superior Court. That brought me to be standing next to Brandon. I was asking for him to be put on probation. I had a letter from a teacher and a counselor at his school. It was his first arrest. The letters attested to his character. His mother and grandmother were there in court. They had been there for every court proceeding. The way the Superior Court works, the lawyer's standing here, the judge is up there. Y'all could be the judge, or you're not going to be the one to be the judge in this story, but the judge is up there, and Brandon's mother and grandmother were right here in the first row. They had been there for every court hearing. They wanted him to come home. The prosecutor in the case was asking for him to go to Oak Hill. Oak Hill is the name of D.C.'s juvenile prison at the time. And whatever its official name was, its real name should have been Dungeon. No functioning school, no job training programs. Some things on paper, if you went down to downtown, they're like, oh yeah, we have this, we have that. It was a lie. They didn't have it. It was a place that you always left out as a kid, worse off than when you entered. The judge that had to make the decision in the case, Judge Curtis Walker, and I should say I changed his name. I changed the name of everybody associated with all of the cases because I wanted to protect the identity of my clients. Judge Curtis Walker looks out in the courtroom and he sees a black man facing sentencing, a black teenager, Brandon, and that's typical. If you go to look at who's charged in D.C. Superior Court, you would think that white people don't live in D.C. or that they don't commit crimes, neither of those being true. African-American defense attorney, black prosecutor, the judge himself was African-American. See, here's where things start to get tricky. 40% of the judges in D.C. are African-American. Judge Walker looks out at Brandon and he says, son, Mr. Forman's been telling me that you've had a tough life, that you deserve a second chance. Well, let me tell you about tough. Let me tell you about Jim Crow. The judge had been a child in those years, so he started to tell Brandon what that was like. And then he said, so here's the thing. People fought, people marched, people died for your freedom. And I tell you this, they didn't die for you to be running and gunning and thugging and carrying on and embarrassing your family and embarrassing your community, carrying that gun. No, that was not their dream at all. So I hope Mr. Forman is right. I hope you do turn it around one day. But right now in this courtroom, actions have consequences. Your consequence is Oak Hill. Locked him up. I was so mad. I was so angry. Still working through it. But as I began to reflect on that, I began to really think about the fact that the judge wasn't alone, right? I told you 40% of the judges. Right? How could he use the same civil rights legacy that motivated me to become a public defender and flip it on its head and use it as a basis for incarcerating my client? But the city council that passed the gun laws and the drug laws, that was also a majority African-American city council. The police force in D.C. was and is majority black. The police chief was black. The mayor was black. The chief prosecutor in the city, then none other than Eric Holder. So what was going on? What was happening? So I began to realize that somebody needed to go back and write the history of the last 40 or 50 years during this period when the United States embarked on this experiment in criminal law, the likes of which the world has never seen, locking up more of our population than anybody ever has in history, starting in the early 1970s. During that period of time, what was happening in the African American community? What was happening with people in power? What was happening with African American elected officials? There was an 800% increase in black elected officials in the 1970s and 1980s. And what were we doing during this period of time? And how was it that this system had become so entrenched, right? So powerful, so dominant a paradigm, a way of thinking about the world, that even some, like the judge, even some in my own community, and I went along for the ride, thought that these policies made sense. Like, how did that happen? That's what motivated me to write the book. Now, we could stop now. Could come up and get the books. And my son is 8. They do sustained silent reading in his school, where everybody gets a reading, and as long as they can be quiet, that's how long they read for. And then when somebody talks, it's over. The kids haven't actually learned out that if they just don't want to read, they just after 30 seconds start talking. So they're still going for like the maximum. He's like, "Dad, we got 24 minutes today." So we could do sustained silent reading, but since I know y'all are busy, I'll give you kind of the highlights of the argument. The first thing that we have to grapple with is rising crime and violence and addiction and the fear that it created in African American communities over the last 50 years, especially in the crack years in the 80s and early 90s, but even before then, in the 1960s, the heroin years. See, heroin was the crack in black communities before there was crack. In the 1960s, the homicide rate in this country doubled. In D.C., it tripled. In New York, it more than doubled. And heroin took its toll. They test everybody entering the D.C. jail every year for substances. And they concluded in 1963, 4% of the people entering the D.C. jail were heroin addicts. By 1969, the 4% had become 45%. Now that's an epidemic. And it's not just the numbers, but it's also the fear that they generate. So one of the things that I did was a lot of the black elected officials in the DC area have donated their papers to local area libraries. And the beautiful thing about these papers, these archives, is that a lot of them gave their whole file cabinets, including the letters that they received from citizens and that they filed away. And so you get this, and it's not, for the students, I just say, it's not scanned, there's no keyword searches. I'm really sorry, but it's like pieces of paper that you pull out of a file and you read. But if you do that for summer after summer, you get this incredible history of a city because you have people writing to their elected officials. This is a mostly black community. Chocolate City, D.C., 70% black in the 1970s, writing to mostly black elected officials. 11 out of 13 of the original locally elected city council are African American. And they're saying things like, "I don't know what's happened to us as a city. I'm afraid. I feel like a prisoner in my own home. I feel like a stranger on my streets. I can't take my kid to school because they're selling drugs on the corner, and I don't want them to see that, and I'm scared. And I can't leave them in the park after school because they're shooting in the park." And then over and over again, these letters end with some form of, do something, do something. You've got to do something about it. Okay. But who's receiving these letters? Because that's the second big argument in the book. The generation of people that are receiving these letters, they are that first generation of African-American elected officials to come into power. That 800% increase I mentioned, right, after the Voting Rights Act and the decline of formal Jim Crow. This is a generation, many of them are from the South. Some of them were in the Civil Rights Movement. My parents knew a bunch of them. All of them were familiar with the long history of under-enforcement and under-protection of the law in black communities. My dad used to tell me about this. I didn't really fully appreciate it until I went and saw how common and how much historical research there was documenting this point. He said, we didn't call the police. In the 40s, 50s, Mississippi, in the black community, crime, you didn't call the police. The police weren't going to come. The Jim Crow police were not going to respond to black victims. And if they did, I'll tell you this, they were only going to make things worse. He said, you know, Southern sheriffs in cahoots with the Klan. They said that's not homicide. If they were asked about a dead black person, they said that's another dead black person. But they didn't use the words black person. Okay, so they remember this history. They're formed by this history. Now they come into power. They have some semblance of power at the local level. And they're bound and determined to make the law respond to those letter writers. Those black citizens that are asking for protection, they are determined to give them the protection that the law historically never had given them. Okay, so crime is rising, people are scared, so they have a motivation. They've got this civil rights orientation, right? They want to respond to these victims and protect them. But why with police and prosecutors? Why is that the response? And here's where, this is a book that's fundamentally about African-American actors and attitudes, right? Black politicians, black intellectuals. But, in a society where African-Americans are 12% of the population, any book that's about African-American decision makers also has to be about the larger power structure, right? Institutional and structural racism, all of the things that limit and constrain the ability of the people that I'm writing about to achieve their goals. So let me talk about what some of those constraints are. The first constraint is historical. The African American elected officials that come into office in the 1970s and the 1980s, they have been elected to represent communities that because of a history of slavery, of Jim Crow, of redlining, right, refusing to give loans in black neighborhoods, right, because of a history of disenfranchisement, because of a history of deindustrialization, because of decisions by the federal government when they had to put highways in the 1950s and the 1960s, when we built the highways in this country over and over again, when had to make a choice, put them down through the middle of what had been vibrant and thriving black communities. Indeed, in Atlanta, it's Auburn Avenue. Used to call it the Black Wall Street. 1950s, had to put the highway, well, where are we going to put it? Right down through the middle of Auburn Avenue, destroying, really to this day, in a lot of ways, that community. So in some ways, it's fair to say that the people that I'm writing about, this group of elected officials, this group of politicians, they had the power to respond to crime, but they didn't have the power to respond to the underlying conditions that cause crime, because the neighborhoods they were representing had been so devastated by a history of racism. Another constraint is a political one. The people that I'm writing about are mostly elected officials, and one of my arguments is that we have to look at local power. They're mostly local elected officials. We have to look at local power if we want to understand how we got this massive prison system. We spend too much time talking about the federal government, not enough time talking about cities and counties. Having said that, there are limits to local power, and you see one of them over and over again in my account. because for 40 or 50 years, African-American elected officials have had what I call an all-of-the-above strategy to fighting crime and violence. Right? They want police and prosecutors. Sometimes they even say we want prisons. But they also say, and they go to Congress and they say, we want more money for jobs, and we want more money for housing, and we want more money for health care, and we want more money for drug treatment, and we want more money for mental health, and we want you to fight segregation, and we want you to battle racism. We want national gun control. We're passing local gun control laws in our cities wherever we can, but we want you to pass national gun control law alongside that. We want a Marshall Plan for urban America. We want the United States government to do for black communities what it did for Europe after World War II, to rebuild, to revitalize, to reinvest. So for 50 years, they go to Congress with all of the above strategy, and for 50 years, they come back with money for one of the above: law enforcement, police and prosecutors. One more constraint, and this is a constraint that we still suffer from today in this country, all of us, I think, to an extent. But they were constrained by their imaginations, by a sense of what was possible in response to social problems. So I'll give you one example. One of the people that I write about is a guy named David Clarke. David Clarke, I mentioned before that 11 out of 13 members of the original DC City Council were African American. 2 of them were white. One of the white members is a fascinating guy by the name of David Clarke. He goes to Howard Law School in the 1960s, graduates and starts working for Martin Luther King, then becomes a lawyer for poor people. Then, in part because of a history of fighting for racial justice issues, he gets elected to this first city council. David Clarke is not a drug warrior. If you don't like the war on drugs, you would love David Clarke, because the first thing that he does when he gets into office in 1975 is he fights for marijuana decriminalization. Marijuana decriminalization, y'all, in 1975. Almost passes, doesn't. Okay, a few years later now, Dave Clarke's the chair of the city council, and heroin, which had sort of stepped back a little bit in the 70s, is now back in force in the 80s. And once again, people are writing letters saying, there's addicts nodding off on a stoop in front of my house. They're gathering in the alleys behind my apartment building or my place of employment. They're on the corners. And again, do something, we got to do something about it. Now, David Clarke, responsible elected official, non-drug warrior, gets those letters, and he sends them to the local government agency, and he says, I've received a citizen complaint about addicts on the corner of such and such, such and such. He then gets a letter back from the head of that agency saying, Councilmember Clarke, we've received your letter, we're on the case. And beautiful for historians because they use that like carbon copy paper, so there's copies of all this in the files 40 years later. Okay. Y'all don't seem as excited about the carbon copies as I am, but that's all right. I was really excited. Who does Clarke send the letters to? Head of Department of Mental Health. Remember, the problem is addicts in public space. Addiction Services, Department of Drug Rehabilitation. Nah. You know who he sends them to. He's not a drug warrior, but he's an American. He's constrained by his imagination. And like so many of us, when he thinks about problem of an addict in public space, citizen complaint, police force. He sends the letters to the police chief. And one of my arguments in the book is it's these kind of tiny decisions that you might not even notice. The choice about which agency to call to respond to a problem. These are the bricks which, when you add them up across the country, across 50 states and across 50 years, these are the bricks that built the prison nation. All right. Let's unbuild it. That's the argument of the book. I've just given it to you. But Ellen told me that y'all are, activists and advocates, and we're not just going to talk about how we constructed this system. We're also going to talk about how we can demolish it and replace it with something that's humane, something that actually provides public safety and justice without the terrible costs and the brutality and inhumanity that we see in our current criminal system. So let's talk a little, let's use the last time that we have before we get into question and answer to talk about some ideas around that. The first thing that we have to do, I believe, is building off of what I just said we lacked when I was talking about imagination. So we have to cultivate a broader imagination than we see in the years that I write about, than we see over the last 40 or 50 years. We have to start, right? We have to start with the radical thought of, well, what if we imagined a world without prisons? What if we imagined a country without prisons? Now, I know somebody, as soon as I say that, somebody's going to be like, whoa, 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 whoa. So I'm not trying to lose you. What if you imagined a world with many fewer prisons, with half the number of prisons, right? What if we had 25% of the number? What if we just had our historical incarceration rates back to the early 1970s, right? If the world with no prisons is too much, okay. That means we need about 15% of the prisons that we have today to get back to that rate. What would be the structures, right? What would be the institutions? What would be the individual choices that we would have to make differently to achieve that goal? But we have to start with the imagination. We have to start wherever you want to locate the dream for yourself, wherever you want to tie it, whether it's no prisons or 20% of the prisons or 10% of the prisons, or, you know, if you're like, look, man, I'm losing this guy already, 50% of the prisons, wherever you need to get to start the thought process. That's where we have to start. Now, let's talk about then some things that we got to do along the way, right? Some of the changes that we would have to make to start to begin to achieve any kind of world that looks anything like that. And here, the first thing that I want to say is that we have to think about acting in our local spaces. How many people, well, you might hear actually, because there's been some news, but like, how many people know the name of the prosecutor who is the prosecutor in whatever jurisdiction you live and vote in? Just out of curiosity. Okay, we got to change that. For the last 40 or 50 years, right, local elected prosecutors have built up this enormous prison system. They're the most powerful actors in the system, even though my dream is that folks go and become public defenders. The fact is they're the most powerful actors in the system. And for a long time, until very recently, we didn't pay attention to who they were or what they were doing, and we didn't even really know, right, who our local prosecutor was. But their decisions about whether to push for have someone locked up without bond or push for a high bond that then a poor person can't pay, their decision about whether to file something as a misdemeanor or a felony, right? Their decisions about whether to push back on the police department when officers are bringing them suspect cases, their decisions about what information to disclose as exculpatory, as Brady, or as part of routine pretrial discovery, these decisions are so powerful and so important. The good news is, and I hope that the next time we all convene, that twice as many or 3 times as many people will know who their local prosecutor is. But the good news is that after 40 or 50 years of people running for prosecutor just on the grounds of I'm going to lock up more people than my predecessor, which is the only way you ever ran for prosecutor for 50 years. Last November, for the first time across the country, there were a series of people that ran on the November ballot, and they ran on campaigns of, my predecessor is locking up too many people, and my predecessor is seeking the death penalty too often, and my predecessor is pursuing a failed war on drugs. These were campaign promises. You didn't get to make those promises and win for the last 40 or 50 years, but they did, and guess what? A lot of folks won. They won in Alabama, they won in Florida, they won in Texas. Guy in Texas, a career defense attorney with the words "not guilty" tattooed on his chest. Yeah, yes, exactly, that's the right look to have, astonishment. I mean, I'm hardcore defense, I don't have "not guilty" tattooed on my chest. He ran for prosecutor and won. Right now, today, in Philadelphia, Larry Krasner is running for local prosecutor. I'm going to be watching that race closely as soon as I get off the stage, and after dinner I'm going to be checking my Twitter account to see what's going on, because Larry Krasner's life as a lawyer was suing police for police misconduct and representing local activists across the LGBT and animal rights and Black Lives Matter. That's what he's been doing. And he said he was going to run for prosecutor, and people laughed at him 9 months ago, because you don't get to be a prosecutor if your main bio line is "I sue police." But he's running, and we'll see if he wins. So figure out who your local prosecutor is and hold them accountable. Universities. Universities can there's a lot that universities can do, again, to either further or combat mass incarceration. And one of the points that I want to make to y'all is that there isn't a neutral stance. You're either making decisions which are helping to make the world more rehabilitative, more restorative, more humane, that involve locking up fewer people, allowing people to re-enter and rejoin society, or you're making the opposite. And so universities around the country, there's a movement now to look at this whole question of ban the box. If you're really interested in this issue, I would look at, there's a new report by Google Community Legal Services in Philadelphia, Ban the Box, Community Legal Services, and you'll see this an amazing report. Lots of universities, the research shows that the questions that we ask on university applications about criminal history are massively overbroad, and they deter a lot of people from even applying, because they pull out the application, they see that question, it's on the Common App, it's on most schools' applications, and it's like, have you ever been convicted any time of your life of any offense, as a juvenile or as an adult, no matter whether it was expunged or not? I mean, where there was a traffic offense, you name it, we want all of that information. And it scares people from even applying. So figure out what Hofstra's position on this, and if it's not the most progressive position that there can be, and again, I would look at the Community Legal Services report on this for samples, because they list a whole bunch of different approaches and model recommendations and model applications. Then push for it to change. Push for it to change. Another thing, and I'll apply this to myself when I think about universities, is a question of, well, what and how are you learning about our criminal system? So I've been giving these talks, and I always try to give lots of concrete examples about what people can do to make a difference. And I started thinking about my own practice. And, I write and I give talks and such, but what about my own teaching? Because the heart of what I do as a professor is teach. And I started thinking about the fact that I could do more. And I got trained in a program called Inside Out. If you want to learn about this program, again, you can Google Inside Out Prison Exchange. Inside Out trains professors. It doesn't matter your discipline. You don't have to be in law. In fact, most people aren't. It trains professors how to teach the class that you normally would teach in your university, but to teach it in a prison. And The classroom is made up of half men or women. I teach in a men's facility, but there are inside out in women's facilities. Half men or women who are incarcerated, and half the students from your home university. And it works just like a regular class. So mine happens to be on the criminal justice system, but there's inside-out classes on philosophy, on architecture, on Shakespeare, on American literature, on math, you name it. It's a seminar. We meet for 13 weeks, 14 weeks, just like we would at Yale, but the Yale students drive up to the prison and we meet in a seminar circle discussing the readings, 20 of us, 10 Yale students and 10 incarcerated students. Most transformative teaching I've ever done. I always tell my colleagues, don't do this for self-interested reasons. It is true that the best teaching evaluations I've ever gotten have been in the inside-out class. And the most meaningful ones are from the students who are incarcerated. One of them wrote in the end-of-year evaluation in the last class, he wrote, I like the law and the policy that we learned. But most of all, I liked that when I entered the seminar circle, I was treated as if I was smart. I was treated as if I had important things to say. And on some days, I even felt like an intellectual. And I don't want to diminish, I don't want to diminish the differences, right? The structural differences between somebody that ends up at Hofstra versus somebody that will end up incarcerated. But one difference, right? One difference, one separation is how you were treated in the education system, right? Were you welcomed into the classroom? Were you routinely treated like an intellectual, like you had something to say? I mean, my students at Yale, like the notion that they would be treated like they were smart is not even like, well, how else would I be treated? Or are you treated like the guy who wrote the evaluation, right? Who was behind in class, acted up, got labeled a troublemaker, and was marked in school so that then no matter what he did, people were looking to put him out. And it's not that he didn't do anything wrong. He owned up to that. He raised some hell in school, but he was marked. He could never overcome that mark. Another young man wrote, for 2 hours a week in our seminar, I could kind of, sort of, a little bit forget that I was in prison. If you're a professor, think about getting trained in the Inside Out program. If you're a student, think about ask your professors, would you be willing to get trained in this methodology? Would you be willing to offer a class where we met inside a prison? Let me give another thought about what we can do. And it's connected to the voices of the men that I met inside, in my Inside Out class. A lot of people, I started out by saying, started this work because it's the civil rights work of my generation. And a lot of people, it's not the first time you've heard that. You've heard that dozens of times. But there's something that we have to fix about this civil rights movement. Because we have to raise up the voices of people who have been incarcerated, who have been convicted of crime. Like again, if we're going to be a civil rights movement, just think about it for a minute. Like what would the civil rights movement look like if the black people were told to stay home while the white people strategized and marched and spoke? But that's actually what the criminal justice reform movement mostly looks like. Because mostly people who have been incarcerated or have been convicted of crime, right? We're not raising their voices up. We're not elevating them into positions of spokespeople. We're not having them lead and run organizations. If you want to change this and do something about it, take a look at Just Leadership USA, run by Glenn Martin. Glenn Martin himself is in New York. He was convicted of a crime, convicted of a robbery, spent 6 or 7 years in prison, has come out, has become a leader in the movement. And his argument is that those that are closest to the problem are closest to the solution. And they've set up a leadership training program so that people who themselves have criminal convictions can be trained and educated and taught all the skills that they need to build on their lived experience and become effective advocates and effective leaders of organizations. So the next time somebody has a conference on this topic, make sure at this university, make sure that they're inviting people to be on the panels, right, who themselves have been in the system. Last thought that I'm going to have, and then I'll stop, is don't be afraid to be unpopular. And what I mean by this comes out of a conversation I had with my father. We had watched a movie about the civil rights movement before he passed. And I asked him when the movie was over, I said, what'd you think about it? Naturally, I wanted to know his view. He was there. And he said, I liked it. I was glad that they showed the history. He said, not that many people read books, or not as many as we would like. He said, but some people get their information from movies. And he said, I liked it, but there's one thing I didn't like. And the thing I didn't like is they made it seem like everybody was in the movement. He said, it wasn't like that. We were unpopular. We were a few people. He's like, when I used to go recruit kids on college campuses to try to get them to come join the movement, administrators wanted to run me off campus. People didn't want their kids joining the movement, get their head cracked in, get arrested. And even those people who did, right, even those people who agreed with us in concept, they disagreed with our tactics. They said, well, why are you yes, we want to end segregation, but y'all are being too radical and rushed about it. You're getting arrested, you're sitting in on stuff, you're disobeying the law, you're marching without permits. Keep that in mind the next time somebody tells you, I agree with the goals but I don't like the tactics. So he said, look, here's the thing, right? Martin Luther King, he said, Martin Luther King of all people, our greatest civil rights hero. In 1966, they did a Gallup poll, and they asked people whether they had a favorable or unfavorable view of Dr. King, and 2/3 of the Americans said they had an unfavorable view of him. I mean, the March on Washington had 250,000 people, but if you ask later, it's like 10 million people were like, yeah, we were there. That was his point, right, is that he said, when you face what appears to be an insurmountable and impossible regime, system, people will tell you that change is impossible. But if you're young and you ignore them and you agitate and you legislate and you litigate and you win and you overcome the system, the same people that told you that change was impossible are going to turn around in a minute and be like, oh yeah, I knew that was going to happen. I was there too. That was inevitable. And then they're going to make a movie about it. So I don't know who in this room and what is going to be the idea or what's the coalition of people. SNCC was founded on a university campus by people that told them that they were wasting time. I don't know which of y'all is going to come together to make this change, but I know that you will. I know that you will have ideas that are better than mine. I know that you will come up and be like, well, Forman said to cultivate an imagination, but his imagination was too limited. Here's why. I want you to say that. Because when you do, and only if you do, will you create the change that is necessary to defeat mass incarceration and replace it with something truly just and truly humane that actually protects communities that desperately need protecting, but in a way that is less abusive than our current system. And when you do that, they're going to make a movie about you too. And I'm going to be there in the front row with popcorn. Thank you.
James, I want to say thank you so much on behalf of this audience, so much for me personally. You can tell he's a great trial lawyer, can't you? I always tell my students, lawyers are really storytellers, and even in that, it was such a great presentation, and obviously the content is amazing. This is a very small piece of the book. There are a lot of stories in the book, historical evidence, stories about James's practice. I really encourage you to read it. It's unlike other legal books that I've read, and I thank you for it, and I thank you for that great talk. So James was my first supervisor at the Public Defender Service. Aren't I lucky? Folks have an opportunity to ask questions. Because we're recording this, I'm going to ask you to come down to the mics, and we want to ask students first, so hustle on in. I always tell my kids the first one in gets their questions answered. Come on down. Don't be shy. You want to just come up to the mic? Sorry, I know it's kind of awkward. I had visions of running around with the mic, but they want us to do it. I'm going to put this one back up there, too.
Hello.
Hello.
How are you?
Maybe just let us know who you are, where you're from.
Hi, everybody. I'm Olivier Labosier from Hofstra Law. I know you laid out many factors as to what caused mass incarceration. I was wondering, what do you believe the fact that prisons are privately owned, well, so not all prisons, but the fact that some prisons are privately owned, do you feel like that plays a bigger role or a smaller role than the factors you laid out?
So I think prison privatization, right, which I would define as not just the ownership of prisons, which, you know, you're pointing out, but also more broadly, all of the private interests that are present in the prison system, whether it's, even if it's not owning the prison, if it's running the telephone system that people have to use to make calls, right, charging people these usurious rates. I mean, Skype is free. I just talked to somebody in Thailand for free, and they charge $3, $4, $5, $7 a minute to collect calls from New York to New York, right? That's a private industry that's ripping people off. The bail industry, right? Imposing unaffordable money bails on people, right? One of the groups that's pushing hard to keep the bail system in play is the private bail bondsman industry. So there are private interests throughout, right, including the running of prisons, but not just the running of probation systems, right? There's private companies that get paid a fee for every probationer that they maintain, right? And of course, as a private company, like, just think of the immorality of it. Your interest, if you're running a probation or a parole or a prison, right, your interest is not in providing the best possible, most rehabilitation-oriented, most humane, the kind of care that you would want if your family member, God forbid, ended up incarcerated. Right? Your interest is making the maximum amount of profit, which means providing the fewest services and putting the most people together in cells and having the sorriest libraries and having the weakest rehabilitation programs and having the worst food. And that, by the way, that's not like a left critique. That's the mission statement. That's in the court. You got to make money. Well, how are you going to make money? Because you get a set fee from the government per prisoner. The way you're going to make money is by spending less on the people that I believe we should be the most humane and dignified in our treatment of. So it's terrible, and it's a part of the problem. Having said that, I think we should be clear that private prisons are a minority of the prisons. About 10% of the prisons in this country are privately owned. Here's where we're talking about actually running the prison. I'm not talking about doing the telephone calls and that thing, but actually running the prison. And to me, private prisons are an example of really the larger problem. And the larger problem is vested interests. The larger problem is people, whether they're private or public, whose jobs depend on warehousing 2.2 million of our fellow citizens. Right? My book is mostly about how the system was built up, but there's really almost a different analytical question about, now that it's here, right, what perpetuates it? Right? And one of the things that perpetuates a system is that people depend on it for jobs. They depend on it for employment. They depend on it for their line of work. Right? That's why you see stories like, you probably saw them, but if not, go back. When they were closing prisons in New York, they got to the point where, because of crime declining and because of some more progressive policies, y'all had situations in your state where you had prisons with nobody in the prison. The prisons were empty, but they were still running because the government couldn't close the prison because people had jobs to run the prison. So the prison existed, people came to work, but there were no prisoners. Now, I like that better than there being prisoners, but imagine what we could do with that money, right, if we were investing it in something else. If we were investing it in communities, if we were investing it in treatment, if we were investing it in alternatives to incarceration. I'd even be for training I don't want, it's hard out there. Like, I get it. So I think any proposal in this direction has to look out for and have in mind providing alternative opportunities for the people whose livelihood, right? When you took the job as a prison guard, you took that job. I'm not mad at you, right? Folks have to work. So, but we have to create a new job for you.
Come on down and line up with their questions. Students? Just give students a minute. Come on down.
This one? Okay. Hi,
Hi.
I'm an undergrad at Hofstra, and I just wanted to know what you think about the recidivism rate for prisons. Why, they're so high? Do you think it's because of, and when they leave, they end up sometimes committing worse crimes than they went off for because of just the lack of, good public running of prisons, because they're so just obviously criminalized, and they're the motto should be rehab and release, but it's just more you can wait here for 25 years and then we'll send you off with a bus ticket when you leave, and so they end up having to steal more or commit worse crimes. Why? Do you think that that's the biggest problem in the judicial system, or?
So I think the question of recidivism, part of the reason is it's caught up in everything that you said. So there's two pieces that I would want to focus on. The first is, how are we treating people who are incarcerated, right? Because you said we hold you for 25 years and then give you a bus ticket. It's even worse than that. It's even worse than that. It's not we hold you in your dignity and we keep you safe for those 25 years. That's not enough. In my opinion, we should also be providing educational opportunities to people, right? That's my whole point about Inside Out and other educational programs. The Barred Prison Initiative in New York, another amazing educational program for people who are incarcerated. Please take a look at that. But I'm saying, just in the question of, are you treated with dignity and are you kept safe, right? We have solitary confinement. Solitary confinement is used wantonly in this country. If you want to read just a short, very accessible piece on solitary confinement, Google solitary confinement, Dwayne Betts, B-E-T-T-S, and you will, Dwayne Betts was my former student. He was incarcerated as a juvenile. He was served about 7 or 8 years. He's an amazing individual against every odd. Got out of school, went to University of Maryland, went to Yale Law School, which is where I taught him, and wrote in the Yale Law Journal about being in solitary confinement and what that does to you. So we don't just hold people, we brutalize them, right? And y'all have heard it before, hurt people hurt people. Well, if you hurt people while they're in our care and supervision, it's only to be expected. To me, it's against the odds if they don't come out having been equipped to hurt somebody else. But on top of that, there's the whole question, you said just the bus ticket, right? That half of your comment. That's right. So the other half to me is employment. Employment for people upon release. The Ford Foundation does amazing work on criminal justice reform around the world. And they were recently giving a presentation at a New York State prison about their work. They had all the leadership of the Ford Foundation and PowerPoints and everything. And at the end of the presentation, one of the prisoners raised his hand and he said, "That was an amazing presentation. Thank you for coming. I just have one question. When I get out, could I get hired at the Ford Foundation?" Right? Now, to their credit, the answer was no, but they scrubbed their HR policies top to bottom. They got rid of about 90% of the exclusions. And they've since become a model employer for people with criminal justice records, because not only have they made it easier to get hired, but they've gone a step further. And to me, this is really kind of the next generation of what employers need to think about doing, is they've actually set up affirmative, well-paid, with benefits, internship programs, which they market to people who have criminal convictions. Because one of the things is we've so stigmatized and demoralized and demeaned people that they don't think they can get hired even if they could, right? So they're going this step further of saying, we're going to make a job available to you. Know, it's like, it's not a guarantee. You've got to come and interview and all of that. It's competitive. But they're open to hiring somebody. So to me, it's two pieces. It's how we treat people while they're incarcerated and what opportunities we do or don't make available to them. And in particular, I would say employment opportunities when they get out.
Hello, I'm Tess Griffin. I'm an undergrad as well. I was wondering if you have any ideas or like thought of any direct action student organizers can take to improve like the prison systems or like destigmatize other than like educating and like voting.
Do you, just out of curiosity, did you not, because
Sorry.
there was something in your tone that made it seem like those two were like bad ideas, but
No, I just like I sound sarcastic.
I definitely will have more, but I'm curious, do you have it? I'm curious because I get the sense behind that question that you might have an idea.
I don't like have ideas, but I think that like when we have these these kind of conversations, we always say, oh yeah, like just talk to your family, talk to your friends to like destigmatize these peoples, but it's like, that's such like, we hear that like almost every time I come to like these conferences or like these panels or anything, and so I was just wondering if you had like another take on it.
Okay, that's interesting because I actually don't think I said those things, but
Yeah.
but I'll give, because I don't think voting corrupt prosecutors out of office is talking to your family members. And I don't think making sure that people who come to the conferences are people that have been, who have been in the prison system, is talking to your family members. But I'll give you another one that's also not talking to your family members, which is something I mentioned earlier, but I'll say it again. How about direct action to make sure that your university has the most progressive admissions policies possible? Does it currently?
No,
There's your direct action.
thanks.
Oh, wait, and one more that comes to mind real quick there's a big movement in New York State right now around eliminating unaffordable cash bail. That's a huge, huge issue. It's desperately crying out for direct student action and organizing, and it has nothing to do with the education system. It has nothing to do with your university. So go check out Bronx Freedom Fund and Brooklyn Bail Fund. Those are two, they're funds where they're raising money to, they have two things that they're doing at the same time. One is they're raising money, and this would be incredible for direct student action because you could both, a piece of it is that they're raising money which they then make as a revolving bank for people who right now cannot afford to post bail, right? People come in many times for low-level offenses, their bail is put on them, they can't afford to post it, and then they're locked, now they're in prison. They're in jail, right? And they just stay in jail. This is Khalif Browder, right? Khalif Browder was in Rikers because he couldn't afford bail, and he said he was innocent and he wasn't going to take the guilty plea, and so he was in jail for 3 years waiting for trial. If Khalif Browder had had any little bit of money, he would have been walking around for those 3 years and he'd be alive right now. So they're doing that, and the beautiful thing is over 95% of the people who get the money from the bail funds repay it back into the fund so then it can be used for the next person. But it's not just that, because they're also, that's like the short-term immediate harm reduction intervention, but they're also engaging people in political advocacy campaigns to change the laws so that judges aren't imposing the unaffordable cash bail to begin with. So Bronx Freedom Fund.
I want to add to that.
Thank you.
Much of what goes on progressively, we think of New York City. Work needs to be done in Nassau and in Suffolk County. And so,
Thank you.
Just Leadership USA, we had a meeting with them yesterday, the New York Civil Liberties Union. They're going to be organizing in Nassau and Suffolk in 10 counties around the state on issues of bail, on issues of discovery, on issues of sentencing. And I will just tell you what, among the things needed in Nassau, if you want a direct action project, it would be great to create projects where you go sit in criminal courts and document what kind of bail is set and disparities in bail depending on the race, depending on the age of the person. That has not been done in Nassau, it has not been done in Suffolk, and it is a critical need. The kind of bail fund that James is talking about doesn't exist here. The models are available, and people at the Bronx Defenders, the Bronx Freedom Fund, we're willing to help. It's doable in Nassau. So for those of you looking for action, these counties they cry out for work.
I love this, the Nassau Freedom Fund. And if a student wanted to get more involved in that, should they reach out to you, or is it?
The the Nassau County Civil Liberties Union, they're having a demonstration actually this Saturday in front of the Nassau Jail. They have an office here. The director is a woman named Susan Getterer. And there's a statewide leader now for Just Leadership USA who just came here yesterday to begin to work on creating the kind of program that James is talking about here in Nassau, and then they're going to move to Suffolk. Nassau Civil Liberties Union. 741-8520.
Yeah, no, that's good. Nobody will say that they came to this thing and we just said, talk to your friends.
My question is, you spoke about having an imagination and imagining things, and as you were speaking about it, a million questions came to my mind to ask, but I just want to get your opinion on it, or anybody in the audience. People get convicted of crimes. They commit a crime, even if they don't commit a crime, they get struck with bad plea deals. But the treatment, how we treat people, you spoke about when they get out. What if, like, we didn't stigmatize felons? What if we gave them opportunities to welfare and scholarships? What if we didn't prevent them from getting certain career jobs? What if we gave them the right to vote after parole? Would that deter people from going back or being put in that same catch-22 where they have to commit crimes in order to survive because we've placed them so low after they've been released of their crime? Because it's enough to serve a time to do more than 5 years and come out and still be punished. But if we took that punishment away once they've been freed, once they've done their time, would that actually help or change the way we see mass incarceration, or would it even deter it, or I don't know, prevent many things? Something.
Well, I mean, everything that I've said so far, I'm trying to say is in the direction of exactly what you're saying. Like, I think our prison sentences should be radically shorter to non-existent than they currently are. But on top of that, to me, one of the most damaging things about what we do is that whether you're incarcerated or not, because you don't have to be incarcerated, once that conviction attaches to you, once you have a felony conviction, or for some things, even a misdemeanor conviction, this is my point about the application, is that it applies to misdemeanor convictions as well, right? Once you have that on your record, then all manner of discrimination follows, all manner of stigmatization, all manner of exclusion. So in many ways, for so long as public defenders, what we thought about was the prison sentence, right? And our whole goal was trying to avoid that or keep that as short as possible. But what the last, to me, 10 years has really shown in gripping detail, again, in part because the voices of people who themselves have been convicted have raised up and pointed this out to people, is that it's all of these other, we call them collateral consequences, but that's like such a bloodless term. Like, we should just call it lifetime punishments, right? Lifetime punishments, losing the right to vote, losing the right to serve on juries, losing the right to get student loans, losing the right to get federal housing, right? Losing the ability to get a job on the private market because of employers who discriminate on that basis. I just got an email last month from a guy who was convicted in the late 1960s, y'all, late 1960s, as like a 20-year-old. He was convicted of, he says in the email, of marijuana possession. And he was recently applying for public benefits in Wyoming. And it came up that he had a prior conviction for, it said violation of the United States Narcotics Act, which sounds like, you were driving a boatload of, coke from wherever, which even if you were, like, it's 2017, you should be able to get public benefits. I don't really care what you did in 1969. But anyway, that's because of the technological revolution, right? That's because of the ability to call up records. And if you're applying for a job or you're trying to get housing, it's not just public housing. A private housing authority can do that same kind of record sweep. And so, yes, in my opinion, a profoundly important thing that we could do is on any one of these dimensions, and I've focused in this conversation around employment and education, but you could absolutely focus on felon disenfranchisement, for example. If you're interested in that issue, the Sentencing Project has a great link on their website, felon disenfranchisement, where they tell you about the state-by-state advocacy efforts. That's actually an area where, over the last decade, we've seen progress. Just 3 months ago, Alabama changed its disenfranchisement law to make it possible for many people who had been disenfranchised historically to now vote. I just saw, all over Twitter this afternoon, are people in Virginia. Virginia has a big gubernatorial election today. And there's people, one of the guys, I saw a video with him, he was convicted of a felony, his rights were restored under a decision by the prior Democratic governor. And he said, 30-second interview, he said, I was so glad to be able to vote today. I felt like I was standing on the shoulders of giants because I know the people that fought for this right for me to vote. So, yes, 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 and more yes. Every single one of those topics you described is worthy of addressing. And let me just say, the last thing I'm going to say on this. I know that as a student, there are so many that there's times where it can feel kind of overwhelming. But in my opinion, you don't have to pick every one. You just pick one. You pick one that resonates with you. You pick one that has a local connection to wherever you live, Nassau, Suffolk, or elsewhere, depending on where you live. You pick one where some other people have begun to mobilize, and you join that effort. And sometimes people think that, well, when I pick one and there's so many, it's going to just feel like I'm not getting anything done. But actually picking the one and taking that first step towards the one, that's the thing that actually motivates and mobilizes you to do more. It's before you've taken the first step. It's before you've picked the one that you feel overwhelmed. But once you pick the one, and you pick the other one, and you pick another one, and you pick another one, once that happens, that's when we create the movement that we need.
Thanks so much.